The Epstein Files Transparency Act, signed into law in November, gave the Department of Justice a deadline of December 19th to release all of their documents related to convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. Since Friday, the DOJ has released batches of Epstein-related materials on what has been described as a rolling basis. In the document dumps were photo of Epstein with rich and prominent people and celebrities, an image of former President Bill Clinton soaking in a hot tub, and some mentions of President Donald Trump. The DOJ posted a statement to X with the release of the December 23rd files that in part said, quote, "Some of these documents contain untrue and sensationalist claims made against President Trump that were submitted to the FBI right before the 2020 election. To be clear, the claims are unfounded and false, and if they had a shred of credibility, they certainly would have been weaponized against President Trump already." Barry Levine, author of The Spider, Inside the Criminal Web of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, has been investigating the deceased sex offender since the mid-2000s and joins Forbes True Crime to discuss what he's learned from the materials that have been released so far. Hi everybody, I'm Brittany Lewis. I am the host of Forbes True Crime. Joining me once again is Barry Levine. He has been covering Jeffrey Epstein for years. He's also the author of The Spider, which is a book that goes into and investigates Epstein's criminal network. Barry, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, Brittany, so much for thinking of me today. Very happy to be with you.
Of course, I always rely on your expertise, and this is no different when it comes to Jeffrey Epstein because tranches of files related to the convicted sex offender have been released by the Department of Justice since their Friday deadline. And from the tens of thousands of documents, photos, emails, files that have been dumped, what are some of your takeaways?
Well, I would say, my main focus has always been on the investigation, and with particular focus to when authorities were first alerted to what was going on. And in addition to that, Representative Thomas Massey, who was one of the co-sponsors of the transparency bill, had told us a couple months back that he noted that there were 20 men who took part in the sex trafficking. And he said that the information was from SDNY, this is the Southern District of New York, witness reports. So I'm particularly interested in what the FBI has done over the years to question these men that have been named by victims. And now we are aware that there's 20 men who were named as far as taking part in the sex trafficking. Some of the things that we've learned, and in fact, there was a document that was released today that talked about the fact that the FBI was focusing on 10 men, not 20, but 10 men who were apparently co-conspirators of Jeffrey Epstein. And the FBI document noted the fact that the FBI was trying to reach out to some of these men. One of the men was in Boston, another man was in Ohio. We don't have a lot of specific information, but it does, to me, from the research that I've done for my book, The Spider, it does connect to men that the late Virginia Roberts Giuffre had acknowledged in depositions that she had been sex trafficked to. So that to me made me happy for the sake of the victims that the FBI and investigators were at the very least taking seriously the men that she and others had named. However, we still don't know, and we're still digging into the files in terms of what actions that went beyond that in terms of corroboration of these men.
And there are still, so many documents were released just this morning, tens of thousands of them. I certainly haven't had a chance to go through all of them yet. I don't think anyone who has unless you have bionic vision and bionic pairs of eyes, you could go through all of them yet. But do we know anything else about those co-conspirators, those men who were involved in this sex trafficking ring? Are they household names? What more do we know as of right now?
Well, I, in fact, named some of the men that Virginia Giuffre had referenced in past depositions. She was involved in defamation lawsuits with Alan Dershowitz, who was one of Jeffrey Epstein's lead lawyers in the Florida prosecution. She was also involved in a defamation case with Ghislaine Maxwell. So there has been material in the past that have been made public where we do know the names of men. Representative Thomas Massey, without acknowledging the specific names of the men, he said that there were several billionaires among the group. He specifically noted that one of the billionaires was from Canada. He also referenced a man in the entertainment community. He said there were some individuals in politics. He said there was a wealthy individual from Italy. So these men who the FBI apparently investigated were all over the world. And I am hoping, and we still haven't had the full release of all of the documents. They are now putting out the documents little by little, but we are getting now into what I hope is the meat and potatoes, where we will find out, in fact, if these men are named, and also what efforts the FBI took to question them. And if not, were they given special treatment? This is something that is very concerning to the survivors of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. Were these powerful men who had been in Jeffrey Epstein's circles given some type of special treatment because of their political status or their connections to people in the government? So this is something that needs to be unraveled here. One amazing document that was located, and it had been reported about early this morning, was the fact, and I found this very interesting, that the Palm Beach police were on to Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell going back to December 2001. And this is interesting because officially their investigation did not take place until 2004 into 2005. So now we're learning that the Palm Beach police were aware of some of what was going on all the way back to 2001. And this document that is been released discusses the fact that there were college girls who were recruited at the Palm Beach athletic campus, and that Ghislaine Maxwell had recruited these young, beautiful women to answer phones for $200 a day at Jeffrey Epstein's mansion. Now, what's particularly interesting is that this memo referenced 3 girls, and 2 of the girls said that Jeffrey Epstein had touched them inappropriately. So this is bombshell news in the sense of when this investigation first went on the radar of Palm Beach police. And we have to now investigate why it took 2 or 3 years more before they began getting search warrants to move in on Jeffrey Epstein.
There was a document that was released that indicates an Epstein victim filed a child pornography complaint against Epstein all the way back in 1996. And as we know, Epstein wasn't convicted in Florida until 2008, which is more than a decade later. What are your thoughts on this? And do you think that the FBI needs to answer for anything here?
Well, I do think the FBI needs to answer for a great deal of this. And I think, however, that we can't really hold them to the fire until we see all of the FBI files, so we can see in their entirety exactly what efforts were made to investigate these co-conspirators and why it took so long for these investigations to take place. But I want to give the government the opportunity to put out all of the material that they have in their hands before we can really intelligently draw questions from that. Now, the other part of the question that you raised was reference to the Epstein victim, Maria Farmer. Maria Farmer has come out publicly. She was the one who first alerted. She was the very first individual in the 90s to alert the FBI to Jeffrey Epstein. And she was extremely pleased last week when these documents were seen in the tranche of material that was released. Now, she was an art student. She had two younger sisters. And I don't know the specific circumstances, but Jeffrey Epstein was able to obtain photographs of her young sisters, one of them being Annie Farmer, who also is another Jeffrey Epstein victim, and also of Ghislaine Maxwell. In fact, Annie, the younger sister, testified. She was one of the four women who testified against Ghislaine Maxwell in the successful prosecution that put Ghislaine Maxwell behind bars for 20 years. Initially, Maria Farmer went to the FBI and said that Jeffrey Epstein had these partially nude photos of her two younger sisters and was sending these photos around, as far as she found out, to other individuals, and that this was child pornography. And in fact, her lawyer has told me over the years, Jennifer Freeman, that the FBI had a very black and white case to deal with back in the 90s. They could have convicted Jeffrey Epstein of child pornography charges. And according to Jennifer Freeman, Maria Farmer's lawyer, this would have been a very easy case to have made against Jeffrey Epstein and could have put him behind bars for a period of time, which would have cut into and would have stopped, in fact, the sex trafficking that took place for 2 decades. So, these are all missed opportunities that the FBI had and the Palm Beach police had to put Jeffrey Epstein behind bars much earlier. What's also interesting about that Palm Beach police report from December 2001 is, why didn't the Palm Beach police really take on Ghislaine Maxwell as part of that initial prosecution against Jeffrey Epstein? They pretty much just focused on Jeffrey Epstein. And at that time, there were 40 victims that they were able to identify. And of course, that led to the notorious non-prosecution agreement, which only put him behind bars under a Florida prosecution of solicitation of a minor. So we have to wonder why the Palm Beach police did not charge Ghislaine Maxwell very early on, when they had information about her in terms of recruiting women going back to college girls going back to 2001.
The DOJ has released some photos in relation to the Epstein files release, and Epstein's pictured with really powerful people like President Bill Clinton, like Mick Jagger, like Michael Jackson. And just this morning, there have been some documents of President Donald Trump. He was mentioned in the release today on Tuesday, December 23rd. And before we talk about them, I do want to read something that the DOJ posted in relation to this. This is what they said. The Department of Justice has officially released nearly 30,000 more pages of documents related to Jeffrey Epstein. Some of these documents contain untrue and sensationalist claims made against President Trump that were submitted to the FBI before the 2020 election. To be clear, the claims are unfounded and false, and if they had a shred of credibility, they certainly would have been weaponized against President Trump already. You told me before in a conversation that you believed Jeffrey Epstein was going to continue to haunt President Trump from his grave. What do you make of what the DOJ said here?
Well, they're obviously trying to get ahead of the headlines which have emerged. I've been following the news today, and certainly some of the new allegations involving President Trump have indeed surfaced. And this was certainly an action that took place very early this morning, in which the DOJ wanted to specifically, and this is really the only time I've ever seen anything like this. This is kind of history making, in the sense that they put out this statement related to the sitting president to basically say to the American public, anything you now read or hear about President Trump, you have to understand that we're telling you that these are claims that are being made that are unsubstantiated claims. So they're really trying to protect him here. And I have to tell you, Brittany, this is from where we were when we first began following this story almost a year ago, last February, when the Justice Department said they would begin putting out documents, and then in July they said they wouldn't put out any documents, and then we went into this long fight over the summer for the Transparency Act to take place. This is absolutely shocking. Today has to be one of the most bizarre days of the Epstein files story to take place with this Department of Justice memo.
And now I want to read an email from an assistant U.S. attorney from the Southern District of New York from January 7th, 2020. And I'm going to read the full email so no context gets lost. And if our viewers haven't seen it yet, they can understand and follow along as well. Here's what it said. For your situational awareness, wanted to let you know that the flight records we received yesterday reflect that Donald Trump traveled on Epstein's private jet many more times than previously has been reported, or that we were aware, including during the period we would expect to charge in a Maxwell case. In particular, he is listed as a passenger on at least 8 flights between 1993 and 1996, including at least 4 flights on which Maxwell was also present. He is listed as having traveled with, among others, and at various times, Marla Maples, his daughter Tiffany, and his son Eric. On one flight in 1993, he and Epstein are the only 2 listed passengers. On another, the only 3 passengers are Epstein, Trump, and then 20-year-old, the names redacted there. On 2 other flights, 2 of the passengers, respectively, were women who would be possible witnesses in a Maxwell case. We've just finished reviewing the full records, more than 100 pages of very small script, and didn't want any of this to be a surprise down the road. What do you make of that email?
Well, I have to say that certainly in regards to President Trump, and we know that they had been very close for more than 10 years. We know that they socialized together. We know that they attended parties together. They were Donald Trump at one point had a modeling agency. Jeffrey Epstein was connected to a modeling agency. These men were in the presence of a lot of young women through of the various parties. Donald Trump has said over the years that he was never aware of Jeffrey Epstein's sex trafficking. And he said it was only until Jeffrey Epstein began taking young women from his spa at Mar-a-Lago when he kicked Jeffrey Epstein out of the spa. And this was around 2004. And this is when their friendship ended. So my focus for all of these years has been, has Donald Trump ever been in the presence of Jeffrey Epstein and any of his victims? And if so, if he was aware of anything, why didn't he end his association with Jeffrey Epstein then? And more importantly, why did he not report this information to the authorities? Donald Trump at that time was a very respected individual in Palm Beach and in New York. He could have fast-tracked any type of investigation if he got on the phone with authorities in Palm Beach or in New York. So I'm particularly concerned about that memo. And the thing that concerns me is when they say he was on a flight with 2 women who could have been possible witnesses to the Maxwell case. And of course, witnesses to the Maxwell case would have been sexually abused by Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. And we know that there were 4 women who testified against Ghislaine Maxwell at trial. Those women at the time of the sexual abuse were indeed underage. One of the women was older. So I'm concerned as to who these 2 women were that were on the plane with Jeffrey Epstein and Donald Trump, and in what context did Donald Trump, what was he aware of? Was he aware that either of these women were in distress in any way? Were they? What was their attitude. Why was he, why were they on the flight? Where were they going? It raises questions as to Donald Trump seeing Jeffrey Epstein with possible victims behind the scenes, away from anyone else, where he was clearly focused on what was going on in that plane. So it is very concerning as to the nature of what was happening on the plane and what did he know about these women. And afterwards, after he got off the plane, did he think that what was going on was appropriate? And if so, why didn't he, ask more questions? These are questions that I don't think the FBI can answer, but these are questions that we have to ask President Trump about.
And A, do you think we'll ever get to the bottom of those questions? Will we ever get those answers? And B, you've said to me before that you've found it disturbing that we keep finding new layers and understanding the depth of the relationship between Jeffrey Epstein and Donald Trump. Do you think that this letter from a federal prosecutor, this email rather, do you think that that reveals anything particularly about that relationship?
Well, I think, I think it raises the question of why authorities did not question Donald Trump as to the specifics of those plane flights in terms of what he knew about the women who were on the flights and the nature of that. It raises questions as to, what he knew at the time. We also a photo was also released the other day from the other release of FBI documents in which there's a photo of a blonde-haired woman with Donald Trump. It looks like the photo was taken on a private plane, and Donald Trump is sitting next to this woman. Her face is blacked out to conceal her identity. This is something that's also concerning as to who this woman was. How old was she? Was she underage? Could this be one of the women that is referenced in this material today? So we just don't know.
The DOJ did say, though, in their release of the most recent documents related to Jeffrey Epstein, that if there was anything that had what they said a shred of credibility against President Trump, it would have been weaponized against him already. But before this, on Friday's release, one of the big headlines were the pictures of former President Bill Clinton. He was pictured in a hot tub. He was pictured in a pool. What do you make of Bill Clinton's involvement in this dump?
Well, I have to say, seeing those photos, Brittany, was very disturbing involving former President Clinton. We do know from the flight logs, and this goes back many years, we do know that Bill Clinton, in his post-presidency, traveled with Jeffrey Epstein on his plane to go to locations for the Clinton Global Initiative meetings and the Clinton Foundation. He caught a lot of flights with Jeffrey Epstein, but these photos are showing us a different side of that. They're showing us that Bill Clinton socialized with Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, and more importantly, that he socialized with women who were in the presence of Jeffrey Epstein. And so this is disturbing in the sense that just like President Trump and the references to him on the plane with possible witnesses for the Maxwell case, this is putting former President Clinton much closer to knowing about Jeffrey Epstein's involvement with these girls. You have to assume that from seeing these photos and seeing women in these pools or hot tubs with former President Clinton. And again, just like President Trump, Bill Clinton has vehemently denied any involvement in any of this. He said he was unaware of Jeffrey Epstein's sex trafficking until the original Florida case, and he disassociated himself with Jeffrey Epstein from that point on. But it is disturbing that there were these very powerful individuals. We're talking about a former president and a current president who were with Jeffrey Epstein in the presence of him with possible victims of his sex trafficking. And it raises the question of what they knew, and if so, if they knew of any criminality, why it wasn't reported.
I mean, the pictures just show how connected Jeffrey Epstein was to the rich and powerful. So I think the two big questions that always hang in the air whenever we're talking about Jeffrey Epstein are, what have you learned about his relationships with the rich and powerful? We can talk about that. And B, what have we learned more about this international sex trafficking network?
Well, I'm hoping, Brittany, that as we get to see more of these files, that we'll see more of these documents that reference the particular third parties that were associated with Jeffrey Epstein, who were possible co-conspirators. But in addition to that, I have always been interested in the men who have been the enablers, who put young women on planes and sent them to Jeffrey Epstein's island in the Virgin Islands. And we know from the Denise George, the former Attorney General for the Virgin Islands, who conducted an investigation after Jeffrey Epstein's death, that young girls as young as 12 years old were being flown into St. Thomas to the airport there for transport to Jeffrey Epstein's island. When they got off the planes, they were wearing ill-fitting college sweatshirts in an attempt to disguise them as being older than they were. And then they were taken on boats or by helicopter to Jeffrey Epstein's island. Now, there are men out there across the world who put these girls on these planes for Jeffrey Epstein, for the sexual abuse. And I am hoping that the files will unlock some of the information about these enablers. One of the enablers was a French modeling agent named Jean-Luc Brunel. Jean-Luc Brunel had a long association with Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. He socialized with them. There's many photos of Brunel with both Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein. Jean-Luc Brunel was brought up on rape charges unrelated to the Epstein case shortly after Jeffrey Epstein's arrest, and he also died behind bars like Jeffrey Epstein. Brunel died in a Paris jail awaiting a trial for rape, and so of course his life is over. But what about the other individuals? What about the other modeling fixers who brought women, telling these young girls that they would be sent to the United States and that they would be receiving modeling contracts, but instead they were just brought to Jeffrey Epstein's island for sexual abuse? Who are these other men, and does the FBI have that information? And we know from Senator Ron Wyden's financial investigation into Jeffrey Epstein that he had obtained suspicious wire transfers totaling $1 billion of monies that Jeffrey Epstein had sent through U.S. and Russian banks to individuals all over the world. And I believe that those men are identified through that financial paperwork. So there is a money trail for the government to go down in an attempt to apprehend these individuals and connect them for sex trafficking, that they were trafficking minors from one country to another for Jeffrey Epstein's sexual abuse. So, I believe that not only in addition to the men who actually took part in the sex trafficking, that there are many other unnamed individuals that could be apprehended who took part in the enabling process.
Hopefully we will see some more of those answers soon, because thousands of documents were released. There's reportedly tens of thousands more still yet to come. And the DOJ had the deadline of Friday to release all of these, and they didn't meet that deadline. But Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche said that they were working diligently on getting all of these out, but there were simply too many materials, and they had to go through and redact victims' names, and that was taking a really long time. But the bipartisan pair who were behind the Epstein Files Transparency Act, they co-sponsored that. They're Democrat Congressman Ro Khanna and Republican Congressman Thomas Massie. They threatened to bring inherent contempt charges against Attorney General Bondi because of the redactions and because that all of the files weren't released by the deadline. And Khanna said that she lost all credibility here. Do you think that this is going to compel the DOJ to move any faster?
I think we are seeing the files being released now on a rolling basis. I think to the DOJ's credit, they are releasing material relating to the sitting president that is not complimentary. In fact, it is rather embarrassing to begin seeing some of this material related to President Trump. But I have to say that there had been concerns from Jeffrey Epstein's brother, surviving brother, that all the references to Donald Trump would be completely erased from the files, and that's not the case. We are seeing references and photos of him in these files. So I do hope that the rolling releases continue. Yes, it is technically, they are technically breaking the law because all of these files were supposed to be released last Friday. However, you're talking about 300 gigabytes of material. That's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of pages of material. And as we see, there's, more than 100,000 photos that the government has. So it is going to take a while for us to see all the material. But I hope at the end of the material, I hope at the end of the files release, that there are individuals that have been identified, that a new investigation could be could take place in which the government tries to work with foreign authorities to apprehend these people. I was surprised to see in one of the files that was released today information from the FBI to authorities in England asking for an interview with former Prince Andrew. While that interview never took place, it does show that the government was taking seriously the claims that had been made by Virginia Giuffre against Prince Andrew. Of course, Prince Andrew has denied taking part in any sexual abuse of any women connected to Jeffrey Epstein, with particular focus on Virginia Giuffre. He also made a large multi-million-dollar out-of-court settlement in New York based on Virginia Giuffre's civil lawsuit against him. But interestingly, we are seeing documents that show that the government was really trying to get an interview with Prince Andrew related to these allegations.
Well, there's certainly a lot to look out for. We've seen a lot of documents, as you and I have discussed, but it still does seem like the tip of the iceberg. And as we get more and more, as more come out, I hope you can come back on and break them down with me. Barry Levine, I always appreciate our conversations and your expertise and investigative journalism. Thank you so much for the time.
Thank you, Brittany. Happy holidays, Jim.